welcome to our February Event Insider session. I'm happy to see all of you starting to tune in here today. I greatly appreciate everyone who is taking their time from their schedule to tune in and join us in today's Event Insider session. I'll also take this moment to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jocelyn. I'll be the host and moderator for today's Event Insider. In today's episode, we will be discussing strategies to best navigate and manage event risks. So hopefully everyone is looking forward to kind of learning about our guest panelists' insight, tips, regarding this topic. So before today's session, we open up 4 polls for everyone to answer. I really appreciate everyone that kind of has tuned in and started to share their thoughts for all these poll questions. I did receive a great handful of responses. So they are still available for everyone to submit their response. But before we introduce our guest panelists today, I do want to share the submitted responses here with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share that right now. So please bear with me since I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So the first question we asked both of you, all our audience members here, is what do you want to get the most out of this session? So some of those responses that came in is to identify potential risk and how to mitigate them, awareness of risk factors associated with events, best practices, help me think of things that I haven't thought of yet in terms of possible event risk, identification of different types of risk for events and how to mitigate them, risk management tips for minors in attendance, continuing education, so they want to learn a little bit more about event planning, fresh information about current direction and strategies for risk management, how can Whova help me to stay within budget, contract language and best practices to protect against a disaster due to weather or health crisis, and also some other information, hope to get information about speaker contracts and photo release forms and learn the key risks and strategies to deal with them. So those are some of the things that you would like to take away from today's session. And then following on with the second poll that we asked you all is, in your opinion, what are the #1 risks in your event planning? So far, the most popular response with 48% of the votes came in for financial and budget overruns. So finances, monies with planning an event is definitely the top risk here that people are always taking into account. Following with that, with 20% of the votes are contractual and vendor issues, with 20% of the vote. And then following with that, with the 12% of the votes here of our participants is health and safety. And then following that, 8% said that their #1 risk is their PR, and tied with 4% of the votes here, all our participants said that their #1 risk is security and privacy, equipment and tech, and staffing. So thank you all for sharing your thoughts here on this poll question. And then following that, we then also asked all of you, in your opinion, what's your #2 risk in your event planning? And following that, with 31% of the votes came in contractual and vendor issues. The second risk that you all are taking into account for here is coming in with 30% of the vote is equipment and tech glitches. Following that, 50% said that their second risk that they're accounting for is financial and budget overrun. 12% of you said security and privacy. And then the others, with 5% of the votes coming in here, said that PR, weather-related risk, and staffing risk are some of the things you are taking into account in your event planning. So thank you all for sharing with that poll question. And then the next one that we asked you all we asked you, or kind of requested that you describe what you typically do to mitigate the top risk you answered in the other poll questions. Some of you said that you overcharge for individual events to overcome shortfalls if possible. Preparation and keeping a positive attitude, use a lot of past reports to help with budgeting, as well as small increases in fees when necessary. Others say our management company researches venues, negotiates with them, and brings the contracts to the board. So having people do all their due diligence to kind of have everything set in place, to have everything in order. Some of you use the Whova waiver form. So that's great to see that some of you are using our tools and solutions to kind of help mitigate some of those event risks, create a budget, and work closely with our finance department to ensure that you do not go over budget. Stay strictly adherence to budget, limit decision makers, work with experienced, vetted, or recommended vendors, keep plain simple, build redundancies. So that's great to see that. Enlisting a great team, more accurate quotes and portfolio requests. Others say plan, test, and have backups, created line items of expenditures, binders for emergency procedures, volunteer tasks, and logistics. And then other responses that came in said manage guarantees and roam blocks. So those are some of the things you all do to mitigate some of the top risks you have answered here in our poll questions. So I want to thank everyone for sharing your thoughts in today's poll questions. I really appreciate everyone taking the time here to share your responses.
If you're interested in viewing more content for event organizers, subscribe to our channel where we will continue to upload interviews with top event professionals and new content on the latest event industry trends.
And with those announcements out of the way, it's officially time to start our panel. So I'll go ahead and introduce our first guest panelist for today. The one I would like to welcome here first on the virtual stage is Linda Joyce Jones. Linda is the Vice President of Administration for Software Solutions. So Linda, thank you so much for being here as our guest panelist. We're delighted to have you here. Would you like to take this moment to introduce yourself to our audience?
Thanks. I'm Linda Jones, and obsessive organizer of people, places, and events. I work for a company called Software Solutions. Been here for 20 years and have planned their corporate conferences, but also planned events of all shapes and sizes. So glad to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your intro here, Linda. And then our next guest panelist for today is Natasha Mawji. Natasha is the co-founder and event director of X's Eyes. So Natasha, thank you so much for also being here as our guest speaker. It's great to have you here. And I will also like to give you a moment to go ahead and introduce yourself here with us, with our audience.
Thank you. XEyes is a global event and creative agency. We have worked globally supporting in-person, hybrid, and virtual events, from small roundtables to industry galas to weddings to even a puppy party. So
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing as well of your event planning experience. So it's great to have you here as well, Natasha. And I'm very happy to have you both here as our guest panelists. So I'm looking forward to hearing from both of you and your thoughts on today's topic, which is about event risk and event risk management. So we'll go ahead and dive in first with these warm-up questions. So Linda, I'll start with you first. Can you share a little bit about the events you recently ran and how many days it lasts, the type, how many people attended, the number of speakers, all that kind of information? Would you like to go ahead and share with us?
Sure. Like I said, I planned events of all shapes and sizes, but the last event I planned was a 3-day corporate conference as a training event. It had just over 250 participants. We had to close registration because of the size of the venue, but we had 7 educational tracks going at the same time with 50 plus speakers and 60 plus sessions. This isn't a big exhibit event. We purposely limit our exhibitors to our exclusive partners, so only about 10 sponsors/exhibitors.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing here with us, Linda. And then Natasha, can you share a little bit about your most recent event?
yeah, one of our most recent events was actually a 3-day medical conference in Texas. We had about 150 people on the ground and over 300 attendees virtually. Most of our speakers were in person. We had a couple concurrent sessions simultaneously as well. And then we had speaker logistics, obviously, for people coming in and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing as well, Natasha. And for this next question, I would like to hear your thoughts on how numerous job surveys indicate that event planning ranks among one of the most stressful professions. Do you agree with this, being your event planner yourselves? And if so, why? So Natasha, I'm going to go ahead and start with you first here for this question.
I don't think it's one of the most stressful positions I've ever had. I think I just kind of remind myself that, it's not surgery. No one's life is on the line. There are stressful aspects of it. I would think one of the most stressful things that our event managers find is trying to get speaker slides in on time. So that is one of the more stressful parts of the job. But I don't think it would be one of the most stressful jobs that we've had.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here, Natasha. And then Linda, what are your thoughts for this question?
I agree that it can be stressful, primarily because there are many components to a successful event where you are not 100% in control. You are going to rely on many vendors and partners to honor their commitment to your event. And it's whether it's the venue, your AV crew, speakers, your team, even the attendance. is out of your control to a certain degree. So from that angle, I think, yeah, there's definitely a little bit of stress involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective there. So I guess rallying people to get things done that some might be a little bit out of your control might be the most stressful aspect of event planning. So I guess that kind of also follows on to this next question is, what do you find most stressful in event planning, given your experience? So I think we kind of covered that already a little bit. Is there any additional thoughts that anyone would like to share? What other aspects of event planning are most stressful? Natasha or Linda?
I think if you just focus on getting as much prepped and planned as you can, and our team, we do a great job with the run a show, run a schedule, whichever you prefer to call it, and focus more on roles rather than people. So that way, if somebody isn't available, you're able to immediately replace that role. It does help in the planning process, so it is less stressful on the day of. But once you've got that planning and mitigation in place for anything that could go wrong, it does take away that stressful aspect of it, because you've already worked through those scenarios of, hey, if this goes wrong, I just pivot to this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Any other aspects, Linda, that you might want to kind of add here, or do you
I don't know. I'm always a little nervous until I see our registration numbers start to climb, and I don't fully relax, I think, until I know I'm in the black when it comes to my revenue covering my overhead.
Awesome. So that's revenue. That's a good revenue.
Yeah.
That definitely. Thank you so much for sharing here, Linda. And then the next question is kind of similar to one of the poll questions we ask our audience members. So I also want to hear your thoughts on it. So what do you perceive to be the most significant risks in event planning? Linda, I'm turning to you here for this question.
For me, I'd have to say it's the safety and security of my team, my partners, my participants. Over the years, I've just come to realize what an awesome responsibility it is, that what we take on as event planners to create a meaningful experience and achieve our goals, but one that it's an environment that's protected from anything that might cause injury or harm. So without that, you don't have a chance of achieving your primary goals, whatever those might be.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing there a little bit about your perspective. And then Natasha, what is your take? What's the most significant risks you take into account for event planning?
I have to agree with Linda. It's the safety of our, attendees. There are different venues that offer different risks. For example, in the summertime, going to exotic locations, boat parties, waterfront. If you've ever had the open bar situation, how do you mitigate those potentials for disaster? Because there's always going to be that one in the group that takes it a little too far. So always communicating with the venue of how do they mitigate those situations. Maybe even having extra staff on hand to sort of steer people away from the bar, having other opportunities for entertainment than just, hanging out by the bar. So it's one of those things where always having that plan B for situations, even like boat parties, people have fallen off boats, going to islands, people getting lost. We've had a search party on an island before. So just making sure that you have all those events planned for, to make sure that, there are procedures in place when things go wrong, because it's not an if, it's eventually something will go wrong.
Got it. Thank you so much for sharing there, Natasha. So yeah, I think I kind of understand a little bit of your take here. So to make a meaningful experience, it also requires to have some safety for your audience to also be able to enjoy their experience. So thank you so much for sharing both your thoughts here for this question. And now that we've discussed a little bit of the type of risk you both find the most important, I also want to ask you if you can share tips to identify other significant potential risks. I know our audience members shared a different other takes here. So how do you be able to identify those other risks and that event organizers should take into account for? So Natasha, I'm going to come to you for your tips first.
A risk register, definitely. It will be overwhelming and daunting to anybody when you first start out, but just starting off with, the obvious. And as you get more experience in the industry, as you work with other people, as you even working with like venues, vendors, caterers, asking them for what their risk policies are. You know, nobody's gatekeeping risks. They will be more than happy to share with you. And this way you can start your own database. You can start, you know, using your risks from one event to the next event, and you can always build and grow on what your risk register is. And obviously, some risks aren't going to be valid from one event to the next, depending on your venue, your location, what kind of event you're running. But you'll also be able to grow and learn as you go through that process, especially with virtual events. You know, if you're going from platform to platform, you'll learn. You know, some platforms are better at aspect A, some platforms are better at aspect B, and you can work that into your risk register as you are building it. But, you know, ask people, right? They're like, I'm sure Linda would agree with me that event planners, we're more than happy to share our perspective and our opinions on things. We're a group that actually wants to see events for other people succeed. We're never going to be like, oh, we're not going to tell you that so I can get the client next year. We're always willing to help each other out, which I find in the industry is really great. So if that's one of the things that is always going to be like, it's paperwork and nobody likes doing it, but it's one of those things that's very helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing some of your tips here, Natasha. And then Linda, any other tips to help organizers identify and account for these event risks?
One of the things that I do is create an hour by hour script that literally helps me work through the event, you know, just hour by hour, minute by minute. What's going to be happening? Where is everyone will they be? What kind of equipment am I going to need at this particular spot at this particular time? And just walking through that detailed timeline over and over and over again helps you identify those potential risks and hazards along the way, and what you're going to do to respond to each situation. So involving your core team is really important in this process and creating that script, because I think you need their perspective to see the whole picture. So involving as many people as you can in the identification process is key.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And then building on from the examples you just mentioned, what potential risks would you recommend other organizers to not overlook within their event planning when planning their events? So Linda, I'll kind of continue a little bit here
Sure.
with you with this follow-up question. Anything that they should not overlook?
Well, again, it depends on the kind of event you're planning. And you know, there's a long list, and it's different for indoor events, outdoor events, you know, those kinds of things. Is it a fair or a festival or a music festival, or is it a corporate conference in a convention center? So, but things I think about are for outdoor events are things like gatekeeping and bag searches, crowd control, you know, choke points that could cause panic in case of evacuation, guarding parking lots and guarding non-public areas, guarding VIPs and dignitaries, weather emergencies, natural disasters, protecting your staff and your team and your attendees from lightning, from extreme heat, extreme cold, wind, you know, the safety after dark. You've got people monitoring parking lots after dark. Do they have the right protective equipment? But then, you know, you turn to the inside events, the corporate events, the trade shows. It's trip and fall hazards. It's lost property. It's you know, written policies for handling money to prevent theft. Background checks for your volunteers. I mean, you can go on and on. And then, of course, it's the equipment and technology failures, which they mentioned in the survey, is always a big one. What are you going to do if your equipment fails? What's your plan B for that? And then, of course, the health and medical emergencies that we all have become familiar with over the last few years.
Awesome.
So, and it goes on and on.
Yeah, no, definitely. You made a very comprehensive list here, definitely on different aspects. So I definitely appreciate it for that list there, Linda. I appreciate that's a great answer. And then Natasha, do you want to add anything else that maybe Linda didn't mention that other event organizers should not overlook?
So I think North America does it semi well, but definitely food allergies and kitchen capabilities, especially on a global scale. Like what you would expect a kitchen in London to do, you cannot expect a kitchen in like Croatia to do. So you have to be very, very clear on what like food dietary restrictions are. And, if it's a religious restriction versus if it's like an anaphylactic restriction, and to communicate very well between like the attendee of what the kitchen can offer. Because normally the communication just goes from the event manager to the catering company. You have to communicate the other way as well. A lot of people don't go verbatim from the kitchen to the attendee, so the attendee is expecting something that they might not be getting. So just making sure that catering is one of those things where people overlook because they're expecting a kitchen experience of where they're from, as opposed to if they're traveling. That's one of the things that are greatly overlooked, in addition to everything that Linda is included.
Awesome. Thank you so much for bringing that point too about catering and food, what you should be offering and how you communicate that to your audience as well. So thank you so much, Natasha. And now that we kind of talked about some risks to identify and account for, what are effective strategies you recommend event organizers to take to measure the impact and the likelihood of these risks happening? So Natasha, I want to hear a little bit of your strategies first.
I think it's just working really well with your team and making sure that everyone is aware of the risks, right? So making sure that you're communicating potential risks and creating these backup plans for time, like anything that could happen. For example, with IT, there's some platforms that don't work in certain countries because of restrictions. For example, Zoom, it does not work for the CIA. We've had events where we've used the Whova platform. Whova was approved by the CIA, but the Zoom integration wasn't approved, and we couldn't figure that out until the day of the event because it just wasn't tested, because we tested the Whova platform and it worked great. So things like that to pivot to like, okay, we have to string through YouTube and things like that. So making sure that your testing is done like extensively throughout, different platforms, different, just because Chrome is used here doesn't mean Chrome is going to be used in China. Just because you're using, your platform works well here doesn't mean that another country's infrastructure is going to be able to handle the bandwidth, right? So making sure that you are doing that extensive testing across the globe if you're doing the global events is one of those things. Making sure that your team feels safe to have those input opportunities to be expressing what the risks are is important as well, so that they can mention things that you wouldn't think of in a foreign country is really important as well. Because, if you are gatekeeping your risks, people don't feel, that they can add to that, right?
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing here a little bit about that global perspective, Natasha, and how to kind of take into those things and how to kind of measure if those risks can happen. And then Linda, do you have any other strategies that you would like to share?
Just to piggyback on that is train your team, make sure they understand your risk assessment, what the potential hazards are, what you've created in order to respond to each of those situations, understanding any written safety policies and procedures you've created, and then train and practice the scenarios, play the what if game. What if you have an outdoor music festival and a 90% chance of heavy rain in the forecast? Do you cancel, do you postpone, or do you bring out the plastic rain ponchos and carry on? I mean, you've got to practice your plan is basically in a nutshell is what I'd say.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that perspective. It's a team, and similar to like sports, you got to practice different plays, different things in order to kind of be able to execute and kind of have success. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here, Linda. And then diving deeper into this topic, do you use any methods, technologies to measure and calculate the probability and impact of these potential risks? So Linda, I'm coming to you again.
I'm probably not the right person to answer this question. I'm an analog girl. Got to just say, I don't use any particular technology. I'll bring out a basic spreadsheet where we identify the risks, identifies response, assess the likelihood of it occurring, and then assigning an owner to develop the response if necessary, and then practicing it with the rest of the team. So pretty simple.
Awesome. Thank you so
Sounds
much.
simple.
Yeah, it does. Thanks for that, Linda. And then Natasha, do you have any methods or technologies that you do to measure and calculate the probability and impact of these risks?
Ours is pretty much a virtual similar spreadsheet. So we have our database, we pull out the different options that we feel that we'll encounter for that particular event, and then it's got the probability, likely impact. It calculates the risk register number, and then it's got the response that we have for it. So pretty much the same thing as Linda, but it's just a online database version.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Natasha. I love how you guys are just saying it very simple. It takes a lot more work and it's probably easier said than done, but thank you both for sharing a little bit about your tips here. And then moving on here from our poll results, we did see that financial budget overrun is a top risk for many, or a concern that people wanted to take into account for. So how do you integrate risk management into your budget and financial forecasting process? And then what are some practical tips for event organizers to assess financial risk within their event budget? So turning to you, Natasha, again for this question.
So one of the things that we do is we build in a line item for risk management. Most of the time we don't have to use it, and we tell the client that this is going to be basically a slush fund for if something happens. We give them scenarios of, if we have to get a third party system in to integrate to be able to use a platform in a country, or if we have to go with 2 catering companies because one does not meet the dietary requirements of a attendee, for example. So there are those options. And then sometimes, if a risk comes to fruition, it's actually cheaper for us. So for example, if a speaker can't make it on the ground and we have to do virtual, actually turns out to be cheaper for us. No flight, no hotel, no per diems, that kind of thing. So, money goes back into the budget. One thing I always recommend, and one thing that we always do, is we over budget and try to come in under. Right. So I'd rather tell a client it's going to cost $100,000 for event and it actually comes in at, 85,000, rather than the other way around. So it's one of those situations where, always go with your worst case scenario when budgeting, right? Because then, like, no matter what, you're going to be safe. Obviously, if your risk is very low probability, if you're having an outdoor festival in the middle of summer, you don't need to account for snow, right? So you don't need to have those sorts of responses in place, but you will have to account for rain, right? So make sure that you're budgeting accordingly, but always go with the worst case scenario of, if rain happens, you have to rebook for another weekend. Obviously, there's the rebooking fee. Obviously, it's moving everybody. It's all that stuff. So have that worst case scenario budgeted as well, and have your 3 stages of budgeting: worst case scenario, best case scenario, and that middle ground of everything went as it should have gone. So you can kind of see what range of funding you're going to need.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Natasha. And then I'm going to turn here to hear from Linda on this point.
I agree. Your expense budget should, automatically include lines for things like liability insurance, safety supplies and equipment, first aid, and any expert staffing you might need to handle things that you cannot safely handle for, like an exhibition management company for a trade show where you've got these giant displays and staging and lighting, and it's gone beyond the scope of what you can safely handle. You've got to hire some experts. So those line items have got to be there. But then you're right, the contingency line has to also be there to cover those unexpected costs, whether it's additional security or backup generators, or anything you might have to procure last minute. Having that contingency built in from the very beginning is a very good idea. If you don't have to spend it, great. But if you do, it's there. And just remember that anything you have to procure last minute is going to cost a lot more. There's going to be rush fees, there's expedited shipping, There's definitely going to be higher dollars involved with anything you have to procure at the last minute. So building in a budget for unexpected costs is a great idea. As far as percentage, I don't know, 5%, 10% it's not unreasonable.
Great. Thank you so much for that point here, Linda. I appreciate your response. And then
Sorry,
pivoting.
I just wanted to add to what Linda said. I've had some success in certain areas, in some states too, actually, where if we let places know that, we're having an event, we might need a generator on this date, they will hold regular pricing for us. So, it might be a good idea to have those contingency plans already mapped out. So you can get things like generators, extra extension cords, certain things at regular price, even though it would be a rush job. So just, if you have that communication with vendors, they might be willing to work with you at a lower cost as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that as well, Natasha. And then I'm going to pivot here to another potential risk. And do you have any techniques to identify and assess potential risks in your vendor contracts, like hotel, venue, catering, any other third-party services that you're using for your event planning? So Natasha, I'm going to hand the mic to you for this question.
So the first one is, especially post-COVID, you have to reread your contracts carefully. A lot of things that were standard in the contract pre-COVID are not standard in the contracts anymore, because a lot of venues, hotels, hospitality took a big hit, with a lot of the language that was in the contracts pre-COVID. So one of those things is, really dig down deep into that fine print. I know it's super easy to be like, oh yeah, like sign and you're good. So that's one of the things. The other thing is to double check, the capabilities of the venues and catering companies to actually, pivot in the case of, changes, right? If you have to change the date, how flexible are they? If you have to change, because of weather, are they flexible? Or because of, you're not reaching your sales, are they flexible, right? Things that, you are using in your risk register to, identify. So for example, if you have to use the AV for a venue, right? Is that AV team capable of doing what you need to do? Right? Are you willing to pay that extra? Those are things that you have to look at beforehand, because, prior to COVID, the venues were more willing to work with you, but once they started taking that hit, they were doing everything in-house. They were charging extra for everything that wasn't in-house, right? So make sure that you're reading those contracts to ensure that you are getting what you're needing as opposed to what the venue is just offering.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And then now on to Linda. Do you have any techniques for assessing the risk in vendor contracts?
I agree with everything Natasha said. The contract language has definitely evolved since 2020 surrounding circumstances that can allow, either party to cancel without penalty. So I would look for words like pandemic or epidemic to be included in that force majeure clause to protect yourself from that particular liability, because if it's not there, it could be excluded, because they did take a hit. And, I totally understand it. But while you're at it, also pay special attention to the clauses in your contract that deal with damages. Your responsibility if your staff or a guest damages something, but also the venue's responsibility in the event of like an equipment failure. It should require the venue to keep all the equipment in the same or better condition as it was when you booked the event. Be sure you understand those terms and those clauses as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Linda. And then to stay on the topic about vendor contracts, can you all share a little bit of insight into negotiating with these vendors to minimize any risk within the contracts and ensure that the service is of good quality? So Linda, I'm going to come to you again for your insights.
Sure. Most vendors have a standard contract that they use for every job. It's something that, they probably had a lawyer draw up, and it provides maximum protection for them and their business. So if this is not, you don't want to cut corners here. If you want to negotiate any variance from their standard contract, make sure it's done in writing and make sure it's signed by both parties. I wouldn't even allow, don't something gets scratched out and handwritten in the margin, and then they ask you to sign it. Don't do it. Make sure everything is retyped and you've signed it and everybody agrees to all the commitments and verbal commitments, even emails. They don't mean much when it's crunch time, in my opinion. So, and then the other thing when it comes to dealing with vendors is just constant communication with your vendors. And the biggest one of all for me is that I want a minimum of 2 day of contacts with cell phone numbers programmed in my phone because if your event's on a Saturday and you're expecting, this person that's providing your stage to show up on a Saturday afternoon to set up, and you call their business phone when they fail to show and they don't answer their phone on weekends. So, you want the phone number of the person who's actually in the truck trying to deliver the stage to you. That's the phone number you want. So make sure you've got the right contact information for those evening events and those weekend events when that company phone may not be manned.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Linda. And then Natasha, do you have any additional tips?
Keep track of your cutoff dates and your due dates. I know vendors will, venues are really great about sending reminders, being like, hey, your, total count is due today or whatever. You have a calendar, put it in your calendar when you sign the contracts. So, there are venues that are like, oh, we got a better paying job. We're just going to not remind them that they owe us the deposit, and then we can cancel their contract. So make sure that you're keeping track of your due dates, of your cutoff dates, of your, whatever dates that you need to be doing things in your own calendar. So that way, you can get ahead of things. You can make sure that you are meeting the deadlines because it's not on the vendor, it's not on the suppliers, it's not on the venue to make sure that you hit those targets. It's on you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And then going a bit further about contracts, and I know this was lightly touched up on one of the some of your responses in the previous questions, but what role does insurance play in your risk management strategy, and what's your advice on how to navigate insurance coverage? So I'm going to hand it to Natasha again here for this question.
So depending on where you are, there are required insurances that you need to look out for. Most venues will tell you what your required insurance are: public liability, special events, liquor licensing, things like that. And then there are optional insurances. So, for, damaged equipment, for injury, for things like that. So you need to be aware of what is required for you to have an event and what is optional. You also need to keep in mind, especially on a global scale, of, what are you able to enforce, right? If you're holding an event in another country, especially for virtual events, I know that some people have been promised A and they've gotten B, and they've tried to go after the platform, but the platform is actually, based in a completely different country. If you might not have a legal leg to stand on. So it's always be mindful of, what you're paying for when it comes to insurance, and really what you're able to legally enforce on for a global scale. Because there are some things that, it's easy when you're going from state to state, or in Canada, province to province, you are able to go after the insurance, but, on a global scale, it's harder to go from country to country. So just make sure that you're aware of that when you're purchasing your insurance.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And then Linda, do you have any other takes here for this question?
I would just say, if you're planning events for a nonprofit or an association, make sure they have liability insurance. Sometimes that gets missed with certain organizations. If you do organizing for a corporate entity, then I'm sure they've got a blanket liability policy that covers their normal everyday activities. But your normal liability carrier may bring in special event insurance providers that specialize and can get you some expert guidance on how to get fully protected depending on the components of your event. They sell specialty insurance. You might want to buy just event cancellation insurance because of a weather event or act of God event. I once had ran a golf outing. It was a fundraiser, and we bought hole-in-one insurance because we wanted to offer a big prize on one of the holes for hole-in-one, and they were willing to insure us on the unlikely event somebody actually made a hole-in-one. They would pay it off the prize. So there's definitely some specialty insurance out there and some companies that deal with these very specifically. So check those out.
Awesome. Thank you for those tips here, Linda. And then moving on to this next question here. This one's a little bit more about some of the priorities you take into account and regarding risk. And it's how do you prioritize on-site attendee safety and event liability? And how do you identify, analyze the potential risk with your event planning process and any measures an event organizer can implement to address these risks effectively? So Linda, I'm going to come to you again and pass this question to you.
Sure. First of all, work with your venue. When you're selecting a venue, you're going to ask a lot of questions. You're going to do your research, talk to other organizations who've used the facility. If there's any way possible, you get on site and do a walkthrough during the planning process. Identifying anything that might create a hazard. What kind of setup can they provide for easy crowd flow? Making sure there's no choke points or blocked doors. Is there adequate space to secure all your supplies, your equipment, your areas that are not public? Ask about their food handling, their social distancing strategies. Do they have policy about firearms inside the boundaries of the event? Has this been, and are you communicating that well? How do you communicate with the staff at the venue during the event? That's super important. I mean, what do you do in case of emergency? Can you get cell phone coverage throughout the venue? If not, how do you contact somebody in case of emergency? Do they have a first aid kit, a first aid room, first aid staff? Do they have an AED machine? Is there anybody trained to perform CPR or use that AED? So just lots and lots of questions that you're going to want to work through with your venue when it comes to safety and security.
Great. Thank you for that, Linda. And then on that note, Natasha, do you have any different viewpoint for this question?
Like Linda said, always do the walkthrough. Like I said earlier, it's always important. Your venue is always going to be your first point of contact for any potential risks. Other event managers that have worked in the space before will always be a good point of contact to see what else they can recommend for, potential risks that you're seeing in that area. And again, once you've got that experience in the industry, you'll know that, another venue had these potential issues. What can I do to mitigate them at this venue? Even things like, tripping hazards. In North America, they will make sure that they tape down all the cords. It's not a thing in other countries because they just don't have that same safety regulations, right? So, we make sure that whoever is going to those events in other countries, they actually go and buy tape and bring it to tape down all the cords because it's just not a thing over there. So we do make sure that, we are bringing standards from higher standard countries to places that don't have those standards just to mitigate our risks in those venues. And again, if you see something that works in another place, why not bring it into a place that, you're going to that doesn't have that ability or that standard. I know that there's one venue in California that we used where no matter what your event was, they had to have EMT standing by. So they had an ambulance there no matter what. If you had 50 people at the venue or you had 3,000 people at the venue, you had to have an ambulance there, right? So we've started doing that. It costs a little bit extra, but if your event has, these three things going on, we always have an ambulance there now. It costs us more, but it keeps our events safer. So things like that.
Great. Thank you for that, Natasha. And then as organizers, we are also proactively having all these details accounted for, like we're having here in our discussion. We're talking about things that we have to kind of keep in place, what we need to practice, what we need to take into account for. But sometimes an incident can happen quickly and unexpectedly. So I'm going to ask our guest panelists if you remember an incident that had occurred at your event, and what steps did you take to determine, its urgency, impact, and all the other factors. And then what was your takeaway when dealing with this incident to mitigate that, in order for you to mitigate in the future for an upcoming event? So Linda, I want to hear from you first.
I had a few to choose from. But I think I'll talk. I was in charge of a 2-day outdoor arts and crafts festival that was due to take place 4 weeks after 9/11, 2001. 400 arts and crafts vendors were booked, 30 food booths run by local nonprofits, more than 200,000 visitors expected in less than a month after 9/11 happened. So our discussions changed from parking logistics and finalizing entertainment for the weekend to protecting the airspace above the festival area, securing cement barricades to place in any area big enough that it might allow a car to access the crowd, what to do in case a suspicious package was found. Our conversations changed dramatically when that happened. We knew we had made the decision we were going to proceed if we could implement the adequate safety measures. And so we had to create a much deeper relationship and partnership with local authorities. And we reached out to the police, fire, EMT, airports, local and county government officials, and asked them to share their expertise and, frankly, their manpower in order to make the event as safe as we could possibly make it. And without their cooperation, we would have had no choice but to cancel the event. So it was a matter of making sure that our team of volunteers were adequately trained. They all had radios in their hands. We, created codes so that they didn't say something on the radio that 25 other people could hear and incite panic, but they knew exactly what to do in every possible scenario. So everybody stepped up. And we changed everything, but that was the day, that I think I understood fully the awesome responsibility that we have as event planners to create amazing events that accomplish all of our goals, but do it in a way that keeps our participants healthy and safe.
Great. Thank you for that. I really appreciate some of your insight here and your experience, your firsthand experience, Linda, for this question. And then I am now going to turn to Natasha. Do you want to go ahead and also share an incident that you've encountered in the past?
Well, not as intense as Linda's, but we were contracted to do a 3-day virtual event. So all virtual speakers, all virtual attendees, about 1,000 attendees. And the 3 days before the event went live, the conference decided that they were going to add a 4th day with 72 additional speakers. So luckily it was on the Whova platform. So we had to pivot. So one thing that we do as an event management company is we prep all the speakers by doing sessions with them prior to them going live, to walk them through the platform, to get them accustomed to how it's going to look on the day of, so they're not surprised. I know a lot of people are just like, here's your link, and then you show up and they're very confused on the day of, but we actually do walk them through the platform, how they can interact with attendees, things like that. So we actually had to bring on the manpower to not only test these 72 speakers within the 3 days as the conference is going live, but also run the concurrent sessions that were already planned with the 3-day conference. So that was one of the big things. And then adjusting the agenda and the online platform, adding the speakers, their bios, their information on the fly, trying to get all that situated and sorted. So it was lucky that we were using an online platform that was so adaptable, and we could add the manpower needed to add all that information quickly and efficiently. But it was one of the more stressful opportunities that we've had to work through.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Natasha, and also sharing your point of view here. And now that we've kind of identified risk, analyzed potential risks with high impact and ways to kind of mitigate and how to work on those risks, I want to start off with how you all plan to, do that and kind of focus to mitigate on not having these risks happen at your events. So to start off, I want to ask you both, do you have event staff especially focused on risk management? So Linda, I'm going to come to you first for this question.
Larger events should definitely have a staff person or a team of people for this important work. Some of the things that I've talked about, some of the larger events, absolutely. You have people specifically focusing on risk management, walking through the event, identifying potential hazards, looking for people who are, maybe getting overcome by heat or trip fall hazards, things like that. You've got to have a team that is specifically looking out for those kinds of things. A lot of the more corporate events are not of that size and scale that require an exclusive team. It's, in my case, it's things I'm doing today. It's everyone's responsibility to identify and address those potential risks.
Great, thank you for that. And then Natasha, do you have staff focus on risk management as well?
We have like exclusive meetings that are dedicated to risk management and risk identification. It's not anyone's individual responsibility to identify risks, but it is an individual's responsibility to mitigate the risks.
Great, thank you for that. And then now that we have a little bit of context of how your team focuses on how they do risk management, what's your approach to developing an effective mitigation plan? Do you have any examples of a specific risk and its corresponding plan you've implemented for past events? So Linda, I'm going to go ahead and start with you first.
I think it goes back to the basics. It's, conducting that very thorough risk assessment, identifying the hazards, identifying how you're going to respond to each situation, creating those written safety policies and procedures, educating and training your team, and then practice your plan. If you're playing that what if game, that I just go back to those 4 steps. I think that's what's going to create a successful plan.
Great, thank you for that. And then Natasha, what about you? Do you have a different take on this?
In the virtual environment, because a lot of our events are global, our biggest risk is IT and working within not only country confines of what is allowed to go through, but individual company requirements. So there are companies where their IT department, we have to actually get bypasses for certain platforms to allow for their internal staff to be able to view and use platforms. So for us, it is extensive testing, regardless of if it works the first time, second time. It's testing across different, internet providers. It's testing across different countries. It's testing across different, time zones. It's making sure that there are people on the ground in those different countries to troubleshoot on the day of if necessary. So those are some of our biggest risks that we always see happen. So it's not a matter of if, it's when. So we have extensive documentation surrounding that and what to do in those cases. And it's more about communication of when this happens, these are the 3 steps you follow before you even get to, let's call this next person up. So for us, a big thing is globally to make sure that our staff is available consistently to do this testing across clients, to make sure that they're available whenever we go live for an event.
Great, thank you for that. And then moving on to this next question here, I know we're kind of hitting the hour mark, and I do want to save some time for some audience questions, but this is my final question to ask you both, and then we'll wrap up with some other concluding questions here. But have you purchased event insurance to provide coverage for unexpected incidents? And if so, what type of event insurance would you recommend for comprehensive protection? So Natasha, I want to hear your thoughts first for this question.
We don't purchase event insurance ourselves. We recommend it to our clients to purchase, just because we work on a global scale, but we are essentially contracted by our clients. So it is really up to them if they want to purchase the insurance or not. We will implement it if they get it, but we'll source it if they want it, but we don't actually purchase the insurance ourselves. Us as a business have $5 million limited liability insurance, but we don't have specific insurance ourselves. No.
Got it. Thank you so much for that, Natasha. And then Linda, do you have any additional thoughts for this question?
I would point people to the liability specialists that specialize in event planning insurance. If there's something that you're going to be doing that is not covered by your general liability policy. Again, I'll go back to the comment about associations and nonprofits, making sure that they have adequate coverage is essential if you're going to be involved in planning an event for them. So you definitely want to point them to those liability specialists for events.
Got it. Thank you for that. So pointing them or heading to the right specialist people for insurance coverages is definitely crucial here. So since we are getting close to the hour mark, I'm going to wrap up our panel discussion with these last two questions. And do you see any changes in the event planning risk and risk management post-pandemic? I know we did briefly talk about those. Has it changed or has it stayed the same before the pandemic? So I'm going to hand off this question to Natasha first.
The language in contracts has changed regarding like pandemic, epidemics, that sort of thing. So really watching out for that is one of the things that has changed with risk management. The other thing is to really just be aware of, what you can really mitigate, right? So what you're calling force majeure, what you're really calling a pandemic. So for example, H1N1 wasn't considered a pandemic, but there was a lot of travel canceled. So they did actually call that force majeure, whereas COVID, they didn't really encompass it under force majeure. So it's one of those things where you really do need to be clear in the language that you're using in your contracts now.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. And then Linda, do you have any other thoughts on this question?
I would point to what I've seen is make sure your registration policy protects your revenue. I see a trend where people are expecting to get full refunds with a very, very late cancellation. I don't know why that changed. We had a long discussion about that, I guess, but make sure your registration policy protects yourself against those late cancellations, and that you have a very well communicated deadline for late cancellation and reasons for cancellation.
Got it. Thank you for that. And then to close our panel discussion with this question, any final tips for other organizers to watch out for or implement to reduce their event planning risk? And then Linda, I'm going to come to you, and then Natasha, you can close our question here.
I'd maybe end on a positive note and just remind everybody that most people show up to an event wanting to have a really good time. And they're going to be pretty forgiving in my experience if everything's not necessarily going according to plan. So, if something goes wrong, you pull out that secondary response you've created, put on a smile, and rise to the occasion and do the best you can with what you have at your disposal. And I think you'll be okay.
Great. Thank you for that, Linda, and then Natasha.
Linda pretty much nailed it. The other thing I would just add is communicate with your attendees. They're more likely to be forgiving if you just let them know, hey, we ran into an issue, we're working on it, we will let you know as soon as we know anything. The worst thing you can do is leave your attendees in the dark, because they will start telling themselves a story about, they don't know what they're doing, or, they don't know there's a problem. So just, again, Whova's great. They have the announcement opportunities. You can send out the announcement and be like, hey, just letting you know we're experiencing an issue. We will let you know when it's sorted, right?
Awesome. Thank you for that. And that wraps up our panel discussion. And we'll now follow the schedule with some of our live audience questions. So I did see a handful of those questions come in. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right to it. The popular question is coming from Mel, and they asked any suggestions for encouraging attendance for free events, particularly when you have limited marketing funds resources. So anyone want to take a nab at this question?
I guess it depends on if it's an in-person or virtual event. If it's a virtual event, I find that people register and then don't show up unless you're charging. So I would suggest do a $2 or $5 donation to a cause. If it's for a not-for-profit or something like that, people are always willing to donate to a cause and they're more likely to show up that way. If it's an in-person event, again, try to make it so that, there's something that they can offer. Non-perishable food item for the food bank or something kind of gets people, feeling guilty if they don't show up.
Got it. Thank you for that, Natasha. And then the next question I have here is, any advice on how to diplomatically deal with unruly guests on the spot? Anyone want to take this question?
I've had this experience where someone was pretty unhappy with me and a regulation that I was trying to enforce. Luckily, I had a radio on my hip and access to some help. But just stay calm, keep your voice low. Don't rise to their level of agitation. To try and keep everything as calm as you possibly can. I often recommend these days you travel in pairs so that you're not trying to deal with a volatile situation alone, but have access to help very close by in case things escalate.
Thank you for that, Linda. And then this next question is from Daniel. They ask, any good strategies to mitigate insane audio video costs? Do you shop around outside the venue? Do you find the venue cooperative with outside companies? Anyone want to kind of address that question, Daniel's question?
So you need to really look into your contract with the venue to make sure that they're not actually going to charge you extra for having an outside company come in. The other thing you need to do is make sure you're very clear about your needs for AV. You can't just be like, oh, I need a couple mics here and a camera there, because then you start getting into the nitty gritty the week before when you do your walkthrough or whatever. And that's when they start charging the last minute fees, because you're adding on right before the event, and they have to source, last minute people to come in and run that equipment. So just be aware of being very clear of the AV equipment you need. And if you're allowed to bring in external people, if you are allowed to bring in external people, the venue is very helpful with that. In that they will let them in, they will show them what equipment they're allowed to use, but it's more so they're not going to be available to give them any extra equipment and things like that if they need it.
Got it. Thank you for that, Natasha. And then I'm gonna probably close our live Q&A. I know we have some other great questions that probably we didn't get that we might not get into because we're probably running a little bit of time. So I do apologize to our audience members for that, but I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up our live audience questions with Sarah's question here. And she asked, what's a good formula to figure out a risk management line item in a budget? Anyone want to go ahead and answer Sarah's question?
I think it depends on the size of your event and really what type of event you're running. So for example, I never do it as a percentage of an event, mostly because if you're doing a 50-person, in-person event, it could have some of the same risks as a 150-person event at the same venue. So I try to go by what the actual risks are for that event and sort of do a costing analysis based on that. But it really depends on the type of event you're running. As you sort of work through events and you sort of get more experience in the industry, you will start to learn that, a generator will cost you approximately, $300. So that's an automatic cost that you're going to add for an outdoor festival, in case you're going to need a generator. So it's small things like that you will learn. But there are some risks that are obviously size dependent, and there are some risks that are going to be fixed.
Got it. Thank you so much for sharing here, Natasha. And then I see already that it's 5 minutes past the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's Event Insider session. So Natasha and Linda, thank you so much again for being our guest panelists. We greatly appreciate you for sharing your insights with us and being here and taking the time to be here with us to kind of educate our other fellow event organizers. I know I got some great takeaways from all your advice and insights on how to mitigate and plan for event risk, and I'm sure our audience members did as well. I know we didn't cover much of the other questions, but I hopefully throughout our panel discussion, they got some great takeaways. And to our audience members, I want to thank you all so much for being here, sharing your thoughts, asking great questions. It was a pleasure hosting this session for you all, and I hope you had a great time learning from our guest panelists on today's topic of event management. So other than that, thank you all once again for attending our Event Insider session. It was a great having you here, and hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye, everyone.